Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome. I'm Sarah McDougall, Director of Scholarship at Benary, where our current exhibition, Cosmopolis, the Impact of Refugee Art Dealers in London, is running until the 6th of September and is open every Wednesday to Friday. It was curated by Helena Cuss, and if you missed Helena's fascinating introduction last week, it's not too late to purchase tickets for the recording. Thank you very much for attending tonight's event. And just a reminder that we are being recorded, so we're asking you to kindly keep cameras turned off and microphones muted to lessen any possible interference. The chat function will be open throughout the event, and I'll give as many of the questions to Jane at the end of her presentation as we can fit in. So I'm delighted to introduce this week's speaker, the distinguished gallerist Jane England, who's going to discuss the legendary German émigré, Bohemian artist, author, and art dealer Jack Bilbo, and the gallery that he opened in London during the Blitz, the Modern Art Gallery. And this promises to be a very fascinating talk. So over to you, without more ado, Jane.
I will open this talk with Jack Bilbo's announcement for the opening of the Modern Art Gallery in October 1941. The Modern Art Gallery opens its gates in the midst of war with the sole aim of giving the modern artist a free and unbiased platform, and of creating for the people an oasis of sanity and construction in a world of false values, believing in the necessity also for an intellectual fight against Hitlerism and all that it stands for. Many London galleries closed during the war because of the German bombing campaign, and Bilbo's small gallery, which began on the first floor of number 12 Baker Street before moving to Charles II Street, became a focus and forum for the avant-garde of wartime London. Jack Bilbo was born Hugo Baruch in Berlin in 1907. He took the name Jack Bilbo in 1933 after his family's theatre outfitting business was confiscated by the Nazis. He came to London in 1936 after an interlude in Spain, as he had been rendered stateless by the Nazis due to his anti-Nazi activities in Berlin. His mother was German-British, and he was fluent in English. Not long before the war, Bilbo made the decision early in 1939 that he was an artist, and he started to paint and to make sculptures. He exhibited his paintings in London at the Arlington Gallery in 1939 and at the Zwemer Gallery in 1940. During his internment as an enemy alien, he was arrested in May 1940, the week before the opening of his Zwemer Gallery exhibition. So Bilbo was soon moved to a transit camp, to Onken Camp on the Isle of Man, where he continued to paint. This is one of the paintings on blackout paper from when he was interned at Onken Camp. And so, because he was using the paintings on the blackout paper used to cover the windows of the huts in the camp at night. And he also organized lectures, concerts, and exhibitions before he was released in November to the Pioneer Corps. Bilbo resigned from the Pioneer Corps in 1941 for health reasons and founded the Modern Art Gallery that same year with the assistance of his future wife, Oo. He installed his own wild and colorful pictures alongside those of some of the artists he'd met in internment. With his huge personality and gift for attracting press interest and press attention, the gallery soon became known and also became a meeting place and venue for refugee artists, including Kurt Schwitters, Samson Chalmers, Jankel Adler, Hein Heckroth, Joseph Herman, and Hugo Dackinger. Bilbo felt strongly that art must not be a war casualty as artists create civilization, and that the coming generation of young artists would shine a torch of positiveness in spite of the darkness of the age. He also published a book titled The Moderns in 1945, which explained why his own definition of modern went back over 100 years. He wrote that the word modern in connection with art also means progressiveness and creativeness, and that all painters were in their and our time avant-gardists, and like every avant-gardist, they were persecuted, ridiculed, and misunderstood. Unusually for the time, Bilbo included works by women and emigre artists in his roll call of the moderns in the book. Not every modern painter or painting can be mentioned in this book. That would take volumes and volumes. So I have mentioned and chosen only those artists and paintings which I, as an artist, author, and manager of the Modern Art Gallery, find most interesting. Fame or obscurity stand the same chance. I have included 3 of my own paintings in the book because I think them good. You see, dear reader, I am not modest. Numerous young British artists, such as Sven Berlin, Eileen Agar, Edward Burrough, Harold Yates, Mervyn Peake, Anna Mayerson, Julian Trevelyan, Peter Jones, Emmy Bridgewater, Ursula McCannell, and Kerry Richards were given the opportunity to hang their work in mixed exhibitions. One typical show, New Ways in Art, was subtitled Young, Surrealists, Constructivists, Abstractionists, Primitives in England. Bilbo proclaimed, in the Modern Art Gallery, merit alone counts. Fame or sales value do not influence the selection of work. The gallery had no rigid adherence to any movement or group of artists. It was as eclectic as its owner. However, surrealism permeated much of the work shown at the Modern Art Gallery. The movement had emerged in part as a rebellion against the society that had enabled the carnage of the First World War and was a reflection of dangerous and uncertain times. Although its origins were literary, the movement's founder, André Breton, soon came to realize that art would more likely need to international recognition of the movement, as producing images transcends any linguistic barriers. With its undercurrents of unease, an unsettling juxtaposition of imagery, bizarre and menacing images, a sense of dislocation, atmosphere of foreboding, and the escape it provided from reality, surrealism was particularly apt for the wartime years. Surrealism had earlier arrived in London with the International Surrealist Exhibition, which opened in June 1936 at the new Burlington Galleries in Burlington Gardens behind the Royal Academy. Salvador Dali appeared in a diving suit, and the exhibition caused a sensation. A few years later, with most London galleries closed during the war, the Modern Art Gallery became a venue that provided opportunities for known and unknown surrealists to exhibit their work. Bilbo's own paintings were influenced by surrealism, and the gallery showed many now well-known surrealist artists, including Eileen Agar, Emmy Bridgewater, Audrey Cruddas, Hein Heckroth, Julian Trevelyan, Charles Murray, and Rita Kern-Larson. The gallery also held an exhibition of prints entitled Surrealism of 100 Years Ago. Emmy Bridgewater was a British surrealist who helped to establish the Birmingham Surrealist Group, an artist collective that was in opposition to what they regarded as an inauthentic, London-based version of surrealism. Bridgewater was lauded by André Breton, who wrote, "Bridgewater brought a new purity of outlook to British surrealism, returning to the early days of the movement, to its automatic beginnings in France. The swirling lines, plant forms, and vaguely suggestive forms seem to have been exorcised from the deep recesses of the mind." Bridgewater exhibited twice at the Modern Art Gallery in 1942, in a group show in May and with a solo show in November. Hein Heckroth was a German artist who moved to England in the mid-1930s and became a designer for film and stage, and an art teacher at Dartington Hall. Like Jack Bilbo, Heckroth was interned as an enemy alien at the outbreak of war. However, Heckroth was sent instead to Australia and endured a grueling voyage on the ship the Dunera, alongside other Jewish artists, musicians, and intellectuals, together with some actual Nazis. Heckroth's friends in the art world, including Herbert Reed, rallied to his defense and arranged for him to have an exhibition of his surrealist paintings in May 1943 at Bilbo's Modern Art Gallery, after which he was allowed to return to England. Heckroth's surrealism was gently criticized in an otherwise complimentary review by Jan Gordon in the Studio magazine as being limited to playing with variations on the comparatively few toys, the forcible space repression, mannequins or empty dresses, eggshells, balls, tripods, etc., invested by the first explorers into the subconscious. Heckroth became renowned for his designs for the films of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, most notably in 1948 for his work on the Red Shoes. His painting entitled Australia, there it is now on screen, was shipped back from his Australian internment and exhibited at the Modern Art Gallery and became part of Bilbo and Owen's collection. It is now in the collection of the National Gallery of Australia. Rita Kern-Larson was one of the artists who is listed as having exhibited at the Modern Art Gallery. She was one of several women in the international surrealist movement, having exhibited with the Danish surrealist group from the mid-1930s. And she was included in the Exposition Internationale de Surrealisme at the Galerie des Beaux-Arts in Paris in 1938 and at Peggy Guggenheim's Guggenheim Jeune Gallery in London in 1938. Audrey Crudders, another surrealist artist, was a South African-born artist who came to England as a child. She became an artist and costume designer for the theatre, and later was part of the artistic community at Great Bardfield in Essex. Crudders had a solo exhibition at the Modern Art Gallery in July 1944. Her painting, The Wrestlers, exhibited at the Modern Art Gallery, was acquired some years ago from England & Co. by the Fry Art Gallery, and many of her theatre designs are in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Her surrealist paintings, as one there, usually on paper, often had a dark and macabre tone, somewhat influenced by the work of Salvador Dali and Edward Burrough, who also showed work at the Modern Art Gallery on occasion. Marion Adams, the provincial but now rediscovered and acclaimed surrealist artist from Derby, had her first solo exhibition with the Modern Art Gallery. When England & Co. held the exhibition Jack Bilbo and the Moderns in 1989, I visited Marion as part of my pre-exhibition research, and although she was unable to come to London, she was pleased to be included in our revisiting of Bilbo's gallery program. Women were given equal opportunity at the Modern Art Gallery. This was perhaps in part because so many male artists were in the forces, but also because Bilbo wanted his gallery to be an unbiased platform for artists. He said that in the Modern Art Gallery, class, race, or religious distinctions were non-existent. To get a picture hung, the picture had to be good. In 1942, Bilbo declared also, in the Modern Art Gallery, merit alone counts. Some contributors are famous or rising artists, others are entirely unknown. Fame or sales value do not influence the selection of work. A famous artist may be rejected just as easily as an unknown artist is accepted. The Nigerian artist Oba Holloway and the Jamaican artist and cartoonist Cliff Tyrrell both were exhibited at Bilbo's gallery. And in 1944, the gallery held an exhibition of contemporary English women artists. Many women artists were given individual exhibitions from 1941 onwards. including a refugee from Vienna, Anna Meyerson, and the young British painter Ursula McCannell, who was regarded as a child prodigy when she exhibited at the Royal Academy in the late 1930s. Early in 1944, Bilbo organized an exhibition called The World of Imagination, an exhibition of oodles, abstracts, surrealism, Merz sculpture, constructivism, and symbolism. The Merz sculptures and oodles were objects made from cast-off rubbish, proving, although not always to the satisfactory of contemporary newspapers, that it was possible to make art out of nothing or anything. In December that same year, the gallery held an exhibition of paintings and sculptures by Kurt Schwitters, with a catalogue introduction by Herbert Reed. The exhibition was accompanied by an evening readings of Schwitters' Dadaist poetry. When England & Co. held our exhibition on the Modern Art Gallery, Schwitters' partner, Edith Thomas, who he had renamed Wanty, was still alive, as was O.O. Bilbo. One memorable evening in June 1990, a few months before our exhibition was due to open, O.O. and Wanty held a very touching memorial birthday celebration for Schwitters at the flat of Bilbo's daughter Mary, an evening of tears and laughter and their many memories. Evenings at the Modern Art Gallery were often centered around Bilbo himself. He held court in the cave in the basement and told fantastic stories, after which the listeners had to decide for themselves which stories were true or false. Bilbo asserted very confidently that on average, 300 people a day visited the gallery, and 30 to 40 friends came at night. A collection of Bilbo's macabre stories, Out of My Mind, Strange Stories, was published in 1944, and the British Museum's Department of Prints and Drawings acquired the drawings for this book from England & Co. after the Jack Bilbo retrospective exhibition we held in 1988. In August 1944, the Modern Art Gallery showed colored reproductions of Picasso's paintings from 1939 to 1944. These reproductions were smuggled out of France and provided the first exposure of Picasso's work of the war years. This was an influential exhibition, and in the following year, the gallery was able to show original paintings and drawings by Picasso, including La Belle Hollandaise, which Bilbo wanted to sell to a British institution. A public subscription was set up in an attempt to raise the necessary £6,000. However, the money was not raised, and Bilbo was unsuccessful in selling the painting. Years later, it was acquired by an Australian museum and is now in Brisbane. To exhibit the La Belle Hollandaise, which was entrusted to him on loan, Bilbo would collect it each day from the basement of a major gallery who had closed its doors for the duration of the war. He would then exhibit the painting, as advertised, from 3 p.m. in the Modern Art Gallery, before returning the Picasso at the end of the day, before the bombs fell on London again. These Picasso exhibitions gave London an idea of Picasso's immense vitality during these years of repression under German occupation and domination, as the Studio magazine described it in a review. Bilbo also held an exhibition of Victor Weiss's anti-fascist cartoons in July 1943, with the title Anti-Fascist Exhibition by Vicky, which was a pretty straightforward setting out of his views. And Vicky was the nickname, or the public name, for Victor Weiss. Bilbo felt that the comparison of known and lesser known artists was an interesting study for the art connoisseur, and proceeded to hang young artists alongside established masters like Picasso, Modigliani, and Matisse. An exhibition of a new artist's work was often teamed with a display of paintings by famous 19th and 20th century English and French impressionists, or important paintings, as he tiled it. Bilbo's selection for his exhibitions of leading contemporary artists also mingled the famous with the unknown, as did his selection for his book, Famous Nudes by Famous Artists. Perhaps we can move some slides. He insisted that I paint only for my own pleasure and sell only out of economic necessity, and that only people I like can buy from the Modern Art Gallery. The gallery also functioned as a publishing house, and Bilbo self-published several books, including his own monumental autobiography in 1948. His friend Oliver Gollancz recalled Bilbo being completely single-minded, concentrating all his energies and powers of manipulation on an objective such as selling a painting, regardless of profit or loss, to buy another, which he said he had to save from a commercial gallery, because only he could see its real worth. Fond of adjectives like the bestest and the most wonderfulest, Bilbo was an energetic, flamboyant, and occasionally very successful art dealer. The News Review wrote in 1942 that visitors came to look at the pictures, but instead they gaped at the powerful, black-bearded, shock-headed figure of a man clad in a loose-fitting green sweater with shrunken sleeves and a maroon scarf. From his bulging waistband hung a thick cord keychain, completing an impression of tremendous strength. His tawny eyes lit up as he talked about the paintings he had hung for the exhibition. The gallery visitors' books provide a fascinating roll call of names. Visitors to the gallery included many celebrities and well-known figures of the day, among them the actor Peter Ustinov, H.G. Wells, J.B. Priestley, Sir Alfred Munnings, Chapman Pincher, James Mason, Rex Harrison, Richard Attenborough, Douglas Cooper, Vivian Leigh, Gustav Kahnweiler, Herbert Reed, and the Duke of Bedford. When the critic and curator David Sylvester came to see the Bilbo retrospective at England & Co., he told me that he had once exhibited a painting at the Modern Art Gallery under the pseudonym of Richard Sylvester. I subsequently found this name in the gallery visitors book on several occasions and in the list of exhibited artists, but David was not inclined to follow it up with me when we held the survey of Bilbo's art gallery. Bilbo had called his gallery modern, as he wanted it to be progressive and creative, and he was particularly proud to claim that his gallery was the first to have fluorescent lighting. Throughout all of his modern art gallery endeavors, Jack Bilbo was ably supported by his wife Owen. They met when she visited her then fiancé, who was interned with Bilbo. She was soon swept away by Jack instead, and became a loyal, ever-patient partner to her larger-than-life husband. And she became a much-loved stepmother to his daughter, Mary, from a previous relationship. Owen was Bilbo's editor, typist, cleaning lady, cook, interpreter, and she made visitors welcome to the Modern Art Gallery. I came to know Owen and Bilbo's daughter, Mary, as I worked on our first exhibition project on Bilbo, which was in 1988. Throughout their later years, living on a boat and moving to Berlin, Owen carefully preserved all that she could from the Modern Art Gallery years: the visitors' books, the scrapbooks of press cuttings and reviews, the correspondence, and many of Bilbo's own paintings and drawings. From the end of 1945, Bilbo and Owen spent most of their time at their house at Weybridge. They finally were able to buy a place, and they christened it Bilbo Bay. There he was able to sculpt, paint, and write. And he also opened an unofficial offshoot of the Modern Art Gallery locally in 1947. The formal program of exhibitions ended in December 1945, although the gallery continued until 1948. Bilbo and Owo left England on a barge in the 1950s, spending a period in France before they eventually settled in Bilbo's home city of Berlin, where he continued his activities as an artist, publisher, and art dealer. And they ran a bar named Captain Bilbo's Hapfelspunker and an antique shop, and this continued until his death in 1967, and Owo returned to England. Thank you. Sarah, you can maybe open things up to any questions that anyone has.
Sure, thank you, Jane. That was a really fascinating talk. So once again, everyone, apologies for difficulties at the beginning. And just to explain, Jane's colleague kindly put all the images on a loop so that they would continue going round, because so many of them are pertinent to everything that Jane was saying, and that's why you see them more than once. And I just popped in a holding slide at the end with next week's talk. So that's why that popped up in the middle there. So I'm going to go to the chat, and I hope everyone's going to get ready.
And we could keep the slides on a loop so that some of the images will still come up.
I will keep them going. While everyone is busily thinking of their questions, perhaps I can get things going. So you told us quite a bit about Owo, which I hadn't known much about her before, and she was obviously really key to Bilbo. Do you think that part of his success was sort of due to the fulfilling companionship that she provided? It sounds like she had many roles there to enable him to sort of live this flamboyant lifestyle and to be such a character. I think one always senses there's usually somebody in the background supporting such an energetic personality.
Oh yes, Owo was really central, I think. She was very quiet, very discreet, but she kept everything together, and I think she was pretty long suffering. I think Bilbo was quite a difficult person to be a partner with. But she managed to somehow make everything, I mean, she really kept the records, she typed all his books, she took the dictation, she basically facilitated everything, because although there were other people that came to help, I mean, Owo was really the center, and she was totally devoted to him. I think he was often fairly monstrous. He wasn't always kind, but she was totally devoted to him and his memory.
Right. Okay. Well, meantime, Melanie Veazey, who is herself someone who knows a great deal about sculpture, has posed a question, and she has asked, please can Jane talk a little about Bilbo's sculpture? I understand that he tried to exhibit at the Battersea Park outdoor exhibitions.
Bilbo made some sculptures in 1939 when he first decided to become an artist. And he, at some point, was able to have them cast in bronze when he was in funds. So they're quite small, and they're mainly nudes, and sometimes there's of different nationalities. But that was all on a fairly small scale. He really had his, and then he made, as you saw in a couple of the images, and hopefully the slides will keep moving again. They've sort of stuck on the him telling stories. You'll see him polishing some sculptures in the gallery, and you'll also see on the wall, you'll see sculptural objects made out of rubbish with like a sort of a big horned sort of, you see there's various sculptures, but one of the other similar pictures, there's an image of a kind of a mask on the wall with protuberances made out of sort of found materials. So he made things, this is one. So he made these kind of sort of vaguely surrealist sculptures, I guess, out of found materials. And then later, the real culmination of his sculptural career was when he was, Owo had moved to Weybridge. He had this idea to make these gigantic sculptures of nudes, and we're talking absolutely vast. I haven't included them because this talk is not really so much about Bilbo as about the gallery. But in Weybridge, he designed and built these sculptures. The armatures were made of things like bathtubs, and the sculptures were absolutely vast. There's a wonderful Pathé newsreel, which you can find on the Pathé newsreel site, which shows him. And he christened one of the sculptures, these vast sculptures, Tits Over London. So you can imagine how well they went down with the neighbours of Weybridge. Anyway, he built these gigantic sculptures. They were in the news, filmed by Pathé. So everyone talked about it. The locals were outraged, but Bilbo was, he was quite proud of them. And so when he and Owen finally left, sold their house, and they went to live on the houseboat, the barge, and set off to live in France. The new owners, or soon afterwards, had them dynamited because that was the only way to get them removed. They were so well built with concrete and sort of an armature of assaulted ironware. But anyway, there are some wonderful images, and I have talked about them before. But so his sculpture career was really in several iterations.
And was there a relationship between him and Schwitters, who came up quite a lot in your talk? And obviously,
Well, he and Schwitters were friends,
yeah.
and
Was there any
when
direct correlation between their sculptures?
I guess some of the Bilbo's found object sculptures had some relation to Schwitter's sort of Mertz sculptures, but I think the intentions were quite different, really. And I think Bilbo's were more on the kind of sort of provocative and kind of, in a sense, sort of more surreal and playful side, I think. So I don't think there was any real connection. It's just beyond the fact that they were making things out of found materials.
Sure. One thinks of the famous film with Tony Hancock and the giant figure, whether that was inspired by hearing about Bilbo's giant.
I'm sure it was. I mean, I think that film, was it called was it The Rebel? I can't remember what the title was. But that film was inspired. It was a sort of composite of several artists, including another artist we showed years ago called William Green, who was the man that was a student at the Royal College of Art and became famous because Ken Russell filmed him riding a bicycle across his paintings to agitate the surface. So he and Bilbo kind of provided the composite for this eccentric artist phenomena in the film.
Fantastic. We have a question here from Karen Taylor, and she thanks you for the talk and says you mentioned that OO cared for the archive and shared it with you during your research. And her question is, what has become of the Modern Art Gallery archive?
The archive is safe. It's in storage with the family and will eventually be going to an institutional home. But at the moment, it's still in use, and but it is in store at the moment. I've had the pleasure of having access to it over the years, as have other sort of scholars in the past. At the moment, it's a little bit less accessible, but that'll be rectified in the future. But it's quite safe.
Thank you. And we also had thanks expressed by other viewers, including Yasmin, who's had to leave us. There's so many things we could pick out from that, of course, but what do you think is his legacy, his importance as an art dealer?
I think he's an example of a kind of, shall we say, a totally maverick figure, and someone who also, I think, was very courageous because he had no money behind him. He had no backing. I mean, he didn't do it, although he liked to have occasionally make money and make sales. I mean, he did it as a pure passion project. And he in a sense, created a cultural forum, and he created a model of a gallery which was not just a sort of a shop, in a sense, a glorified shop, but he created the model of a gallery as a sort of little cultural powerhouse, as a place where people could, as had social, connotations. You could meet there, you'd see your friends there, you could go to talks there, there'd be events. I mean, there were things happening all the time. And I think that creates a kind of model of something that I think some of the larger galleries now are trying to, in a sense, capture that with their programming. And actually, at one point, some years ago, we had a very happy collaboration with the David Zwirner Gallery. And they held an exhibition of Jack Bilbo's work at the David Werner Gallery in London, in Grafton Street. And that was a really successful project, and it was a really wonderful collaboration. And it opened up Bilbo's work to even more people. And I think that, but I think they were interested because of this sort of extraordinary figure. I think it appealed to them as something that they could include in their program, almost as a kind of, not an antidote, but as a sort of an additional figure that I think they wanted to include someone, perhaps it wasn't a sort of totally commercial thing, that they could show that there was someone operating a gallery in a different way in a different time, in very difficult times. I mean, the gallery was basically operating during the Blitz.
Yes, he does seem a character in many ways that was very much ahead of his time. And I know he died in the 60s, but the 60s and 70s would have seemed to have been, the ideal decades for him, in which, there might have been a wider appreciation for his kind of maverick personality.
I think he was pretty much appreciated in Berlin in certain circles. I mean, a friend of mine, Lutz Becker, the art historian and curator and filmmaker, Lutz is from Berlin, and he was taken by his uncle when he was very young to Bilbo's premises in Berlin and introduced to him. And, so Bilbo was seen, and because his uncle thought that this would be a good experience for Lutz for the future. And so, Bilbo was known. I think probably by then he was seen more as an eccentric, but he didn't have any particular cultural sway in Berlin. But, I've seen photographs. People like Henry Miller went to visit him in Berlin. Yeah. I mean, he wasn't totally forgotten. He maintained certain contacts, and he produced cartoons and political cartoons, and he produced drawings, slightly sort of wacky drawings for Berlin newspaper. I mean, he kept himself very active. He never stayed still. And Oa was always there in the background, cooking and looking after everything and taking care of business, really.
And he was obviously able to make these important relationships with many avant-garde artists whom, certainly in Britain, he recognized people like Schwitters ahead of the general recognition. Schwitters, of course, had been widely appreciated at home before being forced to flee, but his recognition here in the UK would be a long time coming. So that was very, perspicacious, forward-looking of Bilbo. And obviously, he made similar relationships. What about his relationships with other art dealers? How was he regarded generally in the trade?
I think I gather he did a certain amount of business with other art galleries. I mean, he was actually evidently a very persuasive salesman when he was feeling passionate about a picture. And so some of the bigger galleries used to let him take a picture on consignment and sell it for them. So, he had relationships. I don't know all the details, but he certainly had business relationships with other galleries. And of course, he exhibited just before the war in a couple of big galleries. I mean, the Zwemer Gallery was a very respected gallery, and he had various connections. So he was well connected. I think these sort of grander galleries probably saw him as an eccentric, but they couldn't help but be impressed by his energy, I think.
And his own work, obviously, as you said, tended towards the surreal, and he showed many surrealists. So again, quite forward-looking of him to be engaging so wholeheartedly with surrealism. Again, in its fairly early days here, there'd been the major exhibition, as you said, but still it wasn't widely recognized. And again, he was at the forefront there.
And I think the other thing is that, as I mentioned in my talk, that I think the fact that he was so supportive of women artists.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the women artists he showed were forgotten for decades, but very recently, with the interest in women artists, a lot of the people, some of whom I met and some of whom I've shown, they've sort of attracted a lot of attention recently. People like Marian Adams, and obviously Eileen Agar, and people are very well known now. But he was actually a lot of these artists were not getting great opportunities in other galleries at the time. I mean, the Mayer Gallery obviously showed many surrealist artists, and there was some crossover between Bilbo's programming in other galleries, and I think there was some sort of exchange. But Bilbo's shows were very original, and he varied the program, and it was a program that reflected what was happening at the time. Because I mean, some of the artists were actually serving in the armed forces, and they would be supplying work. There's that image now is some Schwitter's works on the wall in his show. Some of it, as I say, there is another Pathé newsreel about the Modern Art Gallery, and these are some of the stills I took from it. And there's several Pathé films about Bilbo. And there he is caricatured by Vicky, sort of as this sort of larger than life character with a buxom woman on the wall, one of his own paintings, presumably.
And of course, we have that
and
wonderful.
also always the pipe, because Ebony the pipe was one of his sort of trademarks. He always had this enormous pipe. And there he is with La Belle Hollandaise, proudly having it in the gallery.
Yes. And it's always fascinating to see how he kind of juxtaposes his own name, as you said, with the well-known figures such as Picasso, and as he wrote it, not being modest.
I mean, that's really how my interest in him started. I was reading art history at Melbourne University, and I remember discovering one of his books. I think it was being used as a doorstop, actually, one of the enormous autobiography. And I discovered this book. And then I found on the shelf a book, one of his books, I think it was called Famous Nudes by Famous Artists. And I opened it up, and, you had all the sort of, major artists of the time. You had Picasso and Matisse, and you had Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec. And you had Jack Bilbo, who was also the author. And so I found this hilarious. So these kind of, because they were quite shocking paintings in a way when you first encounter one. So I was quite amused by this character who'd done this book and by his kind of chutzpah, or whatever you say. So I made a mental note that he was to be looked at again. But it wasn't until decades later, when I was living in London and had opened the gallery, I decided I had to find Jack Bilbo and find out, if I could, and find out what had happened to him. And it was very hard because Bilbo wasn't his real name, it was Baruch. And also there was no way of, the internet was not really operating then. So in the end, it was a sort of an accident that I managed to find him. My husband was lecturing at Sir John Cass, where Oliver Gollancz, who was a painter and was an old friend of Jack Bilbo's, happened to be lecturing there at the same time. And I found Oliver's name mentioned in the back of the Bilbo's autobiography. And so I asked my husband to ask Oliver Gollancz if he knew anything about what had happened to the Bilbos. And he then said immediately, "I'll put you in touch with O.O. Bilbo and Jack's daughter, Mary." So that's how it all began. And so we all ended up becoming great friends. And it was a really, I was friendly with Mary, his daughter, until she died. And I don't know if you met Mary, but she was very devoted to her father's memory. I mean, she said he was a sort of monster in a way, but she was very, she did a lot of research, she and O.O., and really, supported his work and was very supportive when we did the exhibitions. And we all had a great time working together.
A larger than life character in so many ways. And we have one last question here. This is from Iona, and she says, did Bilbo publish catalogues?
He published slim little catalogues for the gallery. Yes, there are some. I mean, they're not the catalogues that you might have today. They're not illustrated, but there are catalogues and lists of works. Yes, he did publish, but they're little paper folders, really. And a lot of those are in the archive.
Right.
That's one of the labels from the back, one of the picture labels. But he did small, slim little catalogues or listings for the shows. But his main publications were these books that he self-published through the Modern Art Gallery. At one point, because he was stateless, at some point, that was a sign, I'm showing, that's a sign by a man who showed with him called Derek Sayer. And this sign is now in a collection in Germany. And it was a sign, I don't think it was there all the time. It was a two-sided sign that, it turned up in an auction or something somewhere. But I think it was only in use probably when Derek Sayer had his exhibition at Bilbo's gallery. He made it as a present and it was used sometimes, but it wasn't the permanent sign for the gallery. But it's now in a collection in Germany. But you can see there in that image, there's Bilbo and Oo. You can see the sort of atmospheric way they ran the gallery. And I included this painting, Brownie, because it sort of sums up, shown at the Modern Art Gallery, but it was actually painted and dedicated to Oo. So I think it's a really nice tribute to Oo. And she kept it very close to her all her life.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just flicking through.
There's the sculpture, yeah.
Once again, to give people a last glimpse of this extraordinary character. There he is with a rapt audience as we draw to a close for this evening. I've learned so much. I mean, one knew all these stories, of course, about Bilbo, but you've greatly enlarged and enriched that picture for us. And to look at his importance really as an emigre art dealer and the many refugee and other artists, women artists, as you said, and others that he supported is a really extraordinary legacy. So I want to thank you, Jane, for this wonderful talk tonight. We will release the recording to everyone that was here, and we will try and tidy up those gremlins that we had at the beginning, and I'm glad we managed to overcome them. And thank you for staying with us, Jane. And that slight chaos at the beginning, I think, was very much in spirit of Jack, and perhaps he was looking down on our talk. So there's just a few of our other talks on the screen now. So do join us if you can next week for Cherith Summers' talk about Erica Browson and the Hanover Gallery. Once again, a huge thanks to Jane, and thank you to our audience, and good night.